Some days nothing directly happens to you, and still something feels off. You go through your routine, you sit down, you try to focus on something simple, and your mind doesn't stay where you are. It drifts. Not in a vague way, but toward things that have nothing to do with your immediate life, yet feel impossible to ignore. You check, you read, you follow, you try to understand what's unfolding out there, even when there's nothing you can actually do about it. And the more you stay exposed to it, the harder it becomes to return to yourself. It doesn't feel like distraction. It feels like you're supposed to be paying attention, like looking away would mean you're avoiding something real. So you keep going. You stay mentally present in situations that don't include you, trying to make sense of movements that don't respond to your presence. But something starts to accumulate. A weight that doesn't come from your actions, but from everything you keep carrying internally without noticing. You begin to feel it when things are quiet, when there's no immediate demand, no urgency in front of you, and still, your mind doesn't settle. It keeps returning to what it cannot influence. And at some point, the question forms almost automatically: how to calm the mind when everything feels too heavy to hold. But that question hides something more uncomfortable. Because the weight you feel is not only coming from what's happening, it comes from the fact that you never really step out of it. What makes this harder to notice is that nothing in your immediate environment seems to justify the intensity of what you're feeling. You're not in danger. There's no direct pressure being applied to you. No one is demanding anything from you in that moment. And yet, your mind behaves as if something requires constant attention. As if staying mentally engaged is necessary, even when there is no action to take. This is where the weight begins to take shape, not as something physical, but as something cumulative, a result of repeated exposure without resolution. You keep taking in information, fragments of situations, partial developments that never fully conclude. And because they don't conclude, your mind doesn't either. It keeps circling back, trying to complete something that was never yours to begin with. It doesn't feel like overthinking. It feels unfinished, like something is still open, still moving, still demanding a form of internal follow-up that never actually leads anywhere. And the more this repeats, the more your attention loses its ability to settle into what is directly in front of you. Simple things start to feel heavier than they should. Focusing on a conversation requires more effort. Being present in a quiet moment feels unnatural. Even rest begins to feel like avoidance, as if stepping away from that constant stream means you're neglecting something important. But nothing in that stream depends on you, and that's the part that usually goes unnoticed. Your mind is investing energy into processes that remain completely unaffected by your involvement. It follows, it reacts, it tries to organize, it anticipates, but nothing changes as a result of that internal activity. Still, the activity continues. And over time, this creates a form of internal tension that doesn't come from what is happening, but from your continuous participation in it. At a certain point, this constant exposure begins to change how you relate to what you're seeing. It stops being something you're aware of, and starts feeling like something you're involved in, not directly. But internally, the line begins to blur. You follow events that are far removed from your life, yet your reactions start to carry a weight that doesn't match your actual position in them. There's tension, concern, sometimes even a sense of urgency, without any place to direct it. And this is where something subtle takes hold. The mind doesn't just register what happens, it forms a relationship with it. Carl Jung described how easily a person becomes psychologically entangled with forces that extend far beyond personal life. This doesn't happen through action, but through identification. The boundary between what belongs to you and what doesn't begins to dissolve internally. You start to carry things that never required your participation. And it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like awareness. It feels like being informed, attentive, connected to reality. But underneath that, there is a shift, one that replaces observation with involvement. Without questioning whether that involvement has any function, you try to understand everything. You keep track. You revisit the same situations, as if more attention could bring resolution. But nothing closes. Nothing completes. The mind stays engaged in loops that don't lead anywhere. A role begins to form, one that was never assigned, but still feels real. And this is where the weight intensifies, because now it's no longer just exposure. It turns into responsibility, without action. A form of internal pressure that comes from feeling connected to something you cannot influence, while remaining unable to step away from it. Jung referred to this kind of expansion beyond one's limits as a form of psychological inflation, the sense that you need to hold more than what belongs to your actual life, to process more than what your existence demands, and the mind adjusts to it, until carrying what you cannot control starts to feel normal. If you've noticed this pattern before, this tendency to stay mentally involved in things that never change through your involvement, then you're already seeing something most people overlook. You can subscribe if you want to continue exploring this kind of observation, to keep seeing what usually remains unexamined. You move on from what you saw, but your mind doesn't follow at the same pace. You shift to something else, work, a conversation, a routine task, but there's a delay. Part of your attention stays behind, still processing something that already passed. Not actively, not in a way you can point to. It just lingers in the background, influencing how you think, how quickly you react, how easily you lose focus. And it doesn't present itself clearly, it mixes with everything else. You think it's just fatigue or lack of concentration, but when you slow down for a moment, you notice a pattern. Your thoughts keep circling back to the same fragments, not to understand them fully, but to stay close to them. And that closeness has nothing to do with distance. You don't need to be looking at something for it to remain active inside you. Carl Jung pointed to something simple, but often ignored. What affects you doesn't pass through untouched. It connects to something that's already there, something that doesn't need to be obvious to have influence. That's why certain things stay, not because they demand it, because they find space. You don't decide to keep them, but you also don't interrupt the process, so it continues. What begins to weigh on you is not always what you see, it's what you try to hold together after. You come into contact with fragments, partial situations, incomplete movements, things that are still unfolding somewhere beyond your reach. There is no clear beginning, no defined end, no stable shape to any of it. Still, your mind doesn't leave it in that state. It starts to organize, to connect, to simulate continuity where none exists yet, and this happens without effort. You take something unfinished and try to carry it as if it were complete. You follow threads that don't lead anywhere solid, but your mind keeps extending them, building possible outcomes, anticipating shifts, trying to stabilize something that is still in motion. This is where the pressure builds, not from the event itself, but from the attempt to give it form. You try to make sense of things that are still changing, You try to mentally position yourself in situations that don't include you. You try to reach a point of understanding that doesn't exist yet. And because it doesn't exist, the process doesn't stop. It stretches. It stays open. And your mind stays attached to it, as if resolution were just one more step away. But there is no step, only continuation. Jung wrote about the mind's tendency to impose structure on what is not yet formed, especially when something carries emotional weight. The psyche doesn't tolerate indeterminacy well. It tries to close what is open, define what is fluid, complete what has no conclusion, and when it can't, it keeps working. That ongoing effort has no visible result, but it consumes attention, energy, and time. It creates a kind of internal strain that doesn't come from intensity, but from incompleteness that is constantly being processed. You don't notice it as effort, but you feel it as weight. Because you are holding something that has no stable form, trying to keep it mentally contained, even as it continues to change beyond your reach. And the mind doesn't release it, because it never reached a point where it could. At some point, it becomes clear that the mind is not simply failing to slow down. It continues because nothing interrupts it. Even when the external input stops, the movement remains. Thoughts carry forward what was left open, extending situations that never reached an end, holding on to fragments that were never complete. There is no clear transition between exposure and continuation. One turns into the other without resistance, and the mind keeps moving in the same direction, even in the absence of anything new. This movement doesn't feel excessive. It feels normal. There is always something to think about, something that seems to require attention, something that keeps the process active. When that is removed, what appears is not relief, but a kind of emptiness that the mind is not used to staying in. It doesn't create a strong reaction, but it is enough to push attention back into motion. Trying to calm the mind becomes part of the same process. Attention turns inward, but the movement doesn't stop. It shifts focus, reorganizes itself, continues under a different form. The content changes, the activity remains. And because of that, the sense of rest never fully arrives. What you are dealing with is not a moment of instability. It is continuity. And as long as it continues without interruption, the idea of calming it remains distant, because nothing in that movement has actually come to an end. The idea of calming the mind usually comes with an expectation that something inside needs to be reduced, controlled, or reorganized, as if there were too much happening, and the task would be to bring it down to a manageable level. But what you've been experiencing doesn't follow that logic. The movement you feel is not random, and it is not excessive in the way it appears. It is sustained. It continues because nothing interrupts the way you remain connected to what is still in motion. Calming the mind in this context has very little to do with what is happening inside it. It has more to do with what you stop continuing. There are things that remain unresolved, situations that don't reach a conclusion, movements that extend beyond your reach. The mind tries to stay with them, not to change them, but to keep track, to follow, to maintain a sense of continuity. And that effort doesn't end on its own, because there is always more to follow, more to connect, more to anticipate. So the activity doesn't come from intensity, it comes from extension, from carrying forward what has no natural end. To calm the mind is not to bring it into a better state. It is to stop extending what doesn't belong to your direct experience. That doesn't require effort in the usual sense. It doesn't involve replacing thoughts, controlling reactions, or creating a new focus. It begins when something remains open and you don't move with it, when something continues somewhere else and you don't follow it internally, when a situation has no place for you to act and you don't try to stay connected to it through attention alone. When that continuity is no longer carried forward, something unfamiliar takes its place. There is no clear transition. The movement that was constantly extending itself simply doesn't continue, and what remains doesn't immediately reorganize into anything else. Your attention is no longer pulled in the same direction, but it also doesn't find a new one. It stays without direction, and that state doesn't register as relief. It feels exposed. The space that used to be occupied is no longer filled, and nothing steps in to replace it. What was once constant movement is now just not there. And that absence is difficult to remain in. The impulse to re-enter the movement is still present, so calming the mind is not something you achieve. It is something that begins when you stop resuming. There are things in your life that reach an end. A conversation ends, a task is completed, a day finishes and gives way to the next. There is a natural closure built into what you directly live through. Even when something is difficult, it still has a boundary. It begins, unfolds, and at some point it stops. But what you've been mentally holding doesn't follow that structure. It remains open. You stay connected to things that don't offer resolution, and over time your mind adjusts to that condition. Everything stays in a kind of suspension, without a clear point where it can be left behind. Nothing is fully processed, nothing is fully released, and because of that, nothing truly leaves. And that has a cost. Because closure is not only about events finishing, it is about your mind being able to leave something behind. When that doesn't happen, everything accumulates in the same space, not in a way that is easy to notice, but in layers that don't separate. One situation overlaps with another, one concern blends into the next, and there is no clear distinction between what belongs to now and what no longer has a place. Your mind carries multiple unfinished threads at the same time, not actively thinking about all of them, but never fully letting any of them go. And that creates a kind of internal density that is difficult to name, not sharp pressure, more like saturation, too many things without conclusion, occupying the same space without hierarchy, without an endpoint that allows them to be set aside. You don't notice when something ends, because internally it remains accessible. It doesn't disappear. It stays available, ready to be picked up again at any moment. And over time this becomes constant. Nothing is fully finished. I started noticing this in a very simple way. Nothing extreme, just moments where I would sit down to do something ordinary, and my attention wouldn't stay there. It wasn't distraction in the usual sense. It felt like part of me was still elsewhere, following something that had nothing to do with what was in front of me. And the more I paid attention to that, the clearer it became that it wasn't random. It had a direction. It kept returning to the same kind of things, the same unfinished threads, as if something in me refused to leave them alone. What stood out over time wasn't the intensity of those thoughts, but their persistence. They didn't need new input to continue. They were already in motion. I could step away from everything external and still feel that same underlying activity, as if the mind had learned to keep going without needing a reason. And trying to stop it directly never really changed anything. It only shifted the focus. The movement stayed. That's when it became harder to keep treating it as something caused by what was happening outside. At some point, it became more obvious that the weight wasn't coming from a single source. It was coming from how much I kept carrying forward without noticing, not in big visible ways, but in small continuations that added up. Things I didn't finish internally, things I didn't leave where they belonged, things I kept revisiting without realizing I was the one sustaining them. And once that became clear, the question changed. It wasn't about how to make the mind quieter. It was about how much of that movement was still being continued without any need. There comes a point when you realize this doesn't depend entirely on you. You don't choose what stays in your mind after you've seen it. You don't decide what comes back later, or what keeps repeating when everything around you is already quiet. It happens on its own. You step away and part of it remains. You try to focus on something else and it pulls you back without asking for permission. There is a limit to the control you actually have over it. And when you see this clearly, something changes in your relationship with the situation. The pressure to fix the problem begins to lose strength, because there is nothing precise to fix. But even so, something is different. You begin to notice what is happening while it happens, not all the time, but enough to catch the moment your mind goes back, the moment it picks something up again, the moment it continues something that never needed to be continued. And that doesn't interrupt the process immediately, but it changes how much of you goes along with it. And from there, it doesn't become easier. It just becomes visible. You don't gain control over it. You don't suddenly stop it from happening. The same patterns continue, the same returns, the same pull to go back and stay with something longer than necessary. But now there's a difference that doesn't announce itself. You're not entirely inside it anymore. Part of you sees it while it unfolds, not in a way that interferes, not in a way that resolves it, but enough to notice that it's happening again. The same direction, the same continuation, the same movement extending itself without a clear end. And that doesn't remove the weight. It just changes how closely you stay attached to it. Some things will keep returning. Some things won't fully close, and that doesn't shift on command. But once you see where it continues, it doesn't feel the same to carry it without noticing. If you've been noticing this in yourself, you can subscribe to go deeper into this and other themes like it. Thank you for continuing to follow.